The Center for Critical Thinking and Moral Critique, in concert with Sonoma State University, is proud to present videotape proceedings of the International Conference on Critical Thinking and Educational Reform.
Thank you. This is ninth in a series on how to teach critical thinking. Basically, how to teach critical thinking within the subject matter of any particular course. The first in this series was entitled, I'll give it to you briefly, How to Teach Students to Seek the Logic of Things. And underlying that is the notion that the ultimate ground for intellectual standards and assessment is right built into the nature of reality itself, understood non-metaphysically, of course. The second was how to teach students to listen and read well. So if students are going to be listening continually, then they need to know how to listen critically. And if they're going to read, and indeed they must read, they have to learn how to read critically. And right now our students have low-level listening skills and reading skills. The third in the series was how to teach students to write well. Thinking cannot develop if it is never written out, because it's in writing that you discover and produce what you think. And students do not understand the process of analytic writing, and so that is a problem. How to teach students to assess their own work in the fourth and fifth segments of the program. The first dealt with the concept of the foundations of assessment, getting students to assess their own work, and the second on the tactics in getting students to assess their own work. Why do students have to assess their own work? Because if they're not assessing their own work, they're not thinking critically. Critical thinking is thinking which assesses itself. If they're thinking, but the thinking isn't assessing itself, it isn't critical thinking. It's some other kind of thinking, but it's not critical thinking. Critical thinking is based on criteria and standards, and thinking that assesses itself, applies appropriate standards to itself, and improves itself as a result. And then, the sixth in the program, why students and often teachers don't reason well. Until we face the reality that not only are our students not reasoning well, but very often teachers lack fundamental basic reasoning skills. That is, lack an understanding of what reasoning is, lack an understanding of the various parts that make it up, and lack an understanding of why certain criteria and standards are appropriate to its assessment and others are not. Until that's true, then teachers will not be able to successfully foster reasoning in the classroom. And the kind of fundamental mistake that the California Department of Education made in taking an essay that was fluent, that was witty, that was smooth, that was articulate, and that was amusing, and called it an exceptional achievement in reasoned evaluation, when its reasoning was poor reasoning and or non-existent reasoning. This will continue to happen. And teachers across the land at every level will be grading papers for something other than the reasoning in it, and encouraging students to think that they understand reasoning, they are reasoning well, when they're either not reasoning at all or reasoning badly. The seventh in the program naturally follows from the ones before it. Why intellectual standards? Why teach for them? In that program we explored what are intellectual standards, and ultimately, where do they come from? And there were three foundational areas where intellectual standards come from. One, the logic of language itself. Two, the logic of questions, which of course are put in language. And then three, the logic of reality itself. Now here's one way to look at it. The first two, the logic of language and the logic of questions, is the conceptual dimension. And the logic of reality is the empirical dimension. So there is a conceptual and an empirical dimension which define the intellectual standards we're using. One way to see that, just briefly, is that if you ask this question, is this student irritating me personally? And this question, is this student reasoning well? They are different questions, and to answer them, each of them individually, you have to know what the question asks, and you have to focus on the appropriate data. And so you have to conform your thinking to the logic of the words that you use, and then, of course, ultimately, you have to bring information about reality into it. And if that information isn't accurate, then there's going to be a problem. And if it isn't relevant, there's going to be a problem. And if it isn't significant, there's going to be a problem. So there is a foundation for intellectual standards. It doesn't come from white male Eurocentric philosophers. It comes from the nature of language and the nature of reality itself. Then the next dealt with this question. What is the relationship between reasoning, critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, communicating, and mastering content? And a theme that is running through the whole series occurred there and was developed in relationship to these concepts. It's the theme that everything is connected. And there is nothing worse for us than fragmented curriculum, fragmented learning, disassociated factoids, all of those kinds of things that presently dominate instruction, where students take this, learn it independent of that, learn it independent of that, which is to say, memorize it in the short term, forget it, memorize this in the short term, forget it, memorize that in the short term, forget it. And the point was that the notion of reasoning without thinking critically makes no sense. Uncritical reasoning makes no sense. The notion of critically thinking without reasoning is incoherent, because whenever you think critically, you are reasoning. Now, if you're reasoning, you're producing something. You're creating something. You're producing your reasoning. You're producing ideas. Therefore, you're being creative. Thinking in itself is creative. But creativity without critical thinking and reasoning is perfectly arbitrary novelty. And perfectly arbitrary novelty is not only sometimes not very useful, it is often destructive. Then problem solving. How does problem solving fit in here? Well, reasoning is figuring out, and that's what you attempt to do when you have a problem. You try to figure out the answer. And so if you're reasoning, you must be reasoning about something. And if that something could be accomplished without any thinking at all, you wouldn't be reasoning. Therefore, there's got to be a problem. And therefore, you must engage in problem solving while you're reasoning and doing critical thinking. What about communicating? How are you to learn without reading, writing, speaking, and listening? Well, reading, writing, speaking, and listening are modes of communication. But each of those could be done critically or uncritically. And one done critically, that is, in a higher order level, you are reasoning, engaging in critical thinking. You're thinking critically about the text. And I don't mean by that judging it, this is good, this is bad. I mean using your thinking to figure out the logic of what the person means. Reasoning your way through it, figuring it out. Because here you have the logic of an author, and here you have the logic of your thinking. How do you get the logic of the author into your own thinking? That's a problem for reasoning, and has been delineated as such long ago in Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book. published 1939. And then finally, mastering content. Mastering content over here, thinking over there. I'd like to do more thinking, I'd like to do more problem solving, I'd like to have them do more writing, but I've got to cover the content. And I developed the notion as to why this is totally incoherent. This does not make any sense. The basic thrust of it is that content is by nature a product of thinking. And if you take thinking out of content, it evaporates. It doesn't exist. Content is not a natural product. It's something thought through and represented, expressed, lives, is embodied in thinking. And so when you try to break it up into pieces that are unconnected, it loses its content. It loses its meaning. It ceases to be what it is. And so this was the attempt to, and the title was Reasoning, Critical Thinking, Creativity, Problem Solving, Communicating, Mastering Content, putting it all together. Seeing we don't need 6 programs. We need one good program, and it has nothing other to do than mastering the content. It's not something other than that. It's the way to do that and do it well. Of course, we have to be sensitive too. We may need to bring more content in, or different content, or alternative content, and so forth, because content being created by minds is something we decide upon. It isn't given in nature. Okay, so here we are. If we presuppose all of that roughly in the background, we're now ready to devise assignments and activities that require students to do reasoning that they're capable of doing, and so let's get into that. Here is a triad which I have introduced at the beginning of a number of these programs, and let's look at them briefly. The logic of reasoning, the logic of the content, the logic of the student's thinking. And remember this, when I say the logic of, I don't mean formal logic. I don't mean something esoteric. I mean the system of meanings with logical interrelationships that make sense of the thing. And earlier on we talked about how, for example, just to understand a dog involves understanding that if it's a dog, it'll bark rather than mew, will not fly, needs oxygen, is a mammal, and so forth and so on. That is, to say it's the one implies the other. There's a logic here. We don't just pick characteristics for dogs out of our hat, and they have no logical relationships. They're all logically interconnected. All right, now the logic of reasoning itself has various parts. And this is, of course, part of what we have to take into account in doing our assignments. So let's look at the logic of reasoning from the point of view of constructing assignments. Here are the parts of reasoning: purpose, question, information. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning. I don't want to give you a long list that you can't remember. You can't reason without a purpose. Okay? Okay, you give the students an assignment. How do they know what the purpose of the assignment is? It's not a good assignment if they don't know what the purpose is. And how do you find the purpose? Relate the assignment to the purpose of the course. That is, purposes serve other purposes, and all assignments are supposed to come back to the fundamental purpose of the course. And of course, if you want really comprehensive understanding of the purpose of the assignment, go back to the purpose of education, which is the reason why we have the course. And there should be occasions where students think about the purpose of education, somewhere while they're going through education. They might as well know what it's all for. And then they're in this particular class. What are we trying to accomplish in this class? So it has implications that right at the beginning of a course, beginning of a semester, teachers and professors should talk about what they're trying to accomplish in the course and what people who work with this subject are trying to accomplish, or what they're about in doing the thing that this course is all about. So that's purpose. And on the assignment, it must have a purpose that fits in with the broader purpose so that the students have a kind of sense of where they're going and how they're getting there. So we can look at an assignment and look at it in terms of the purpose of the course and whether the students are likely to get the purpose of the assignment, to see how it fits in, to see why it's significant. Because we know if somebody considers a task insignificant or irrelevant, they're not going to put much energy into it. And since most students don't see the significance of most assignments, they don't put much energy into them. Now, admittedly, if we want them to reason, which is what we want them to do, their purpose must be accomplishable by and require their solving at least one problem. Now, suppose you said, I remember from an elementary school class that I had in Chicago, here was the assignment we got every day, and I never did get the purpose. The assignment was to copy this page out of our book in longhand and then bring it up to the teacher to be stamped when we finished. And we did this day after day after day, copying in longhand what was on this page and that, and then we would get it stamped. None of us thought to ask the purpose of it because you weren't supposed to do things like that, I guess. And none of us expected there to be a purpose. We sort of liked the simplicity of the logic. This particular teacher liked to read the newspaper and had to have something to do while we were copying our pages down. And so this was part of course, the good old days when we really did it right. Okay, so then you must know what is the problem that the students are going to reason about. And of course, this implies that the assignment is problem-based. So we need problem-based assignment. There has to be a problem that you're going to reason about. Now, of course, there are many, many kinds of problems. Don't link it to a train leaves San Francisco at so many miles an hour when another one leaves from Boston at so many miles an hour. At what point will they meet? I mean, that could be a problem, but I mean, don't think of problems in that vein. Simply, it could be the problem of understanding the first chapter of the book. It could be a problem in reading. It could be a problem in listening. It could, whatever it is you're figuring out. Do you see? It has to be figuring out something. And so one of the things I'm going to ask on assignment, well, what do the students have to figure out in this assignment? Now, whenever you're figuring something out, that is, whenever you're reasoning, inevitably you're going to need some of this information. And so you give the students this problem in reasoning to figure out. I'm going to ask, do they have the information necessary to figure that out? Now, your assignment might be, well, I'm going to give them a problem, and the right answer is we don't have the information to solve this problem. That's okay. That might be an interesting assignment. That every so often you'd give them an assignment which requires information that they couldn't possibly have. If they go ahead and they answer, then you say, all of you who came up with an answer, you missed it. The correct answer is, we can't get an answer. That's what a reasoning mind would come to. And that's figuring out something really of quite of significance. You've heard Ellen Schoenfeld's favorite example. He gives elementary school children this problem. There are 75 sheep in the field and 5 sheepdogs. How old is the shepherd? And 4 out of 5 add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Because they don't believe that there are problems where the correct answer is, you can't get to there from here. Okay, so information. Where are they going to get the information? What information do they need? Are you really sure that you even know what information is needed to solve this problem? Then the next part of reasoning is what it is you have to do when you get information. Well, information has to be interpreted, has to be given a meaning. And so what sort of ideas, what sort of concepts do the students need in order to give this information a meaning, and do they have a chance at that? If they don't have the concepts or ideas at all, and there's no reasonable way that they could figure them out, then this is not a good assignment, because you're just going to show that they don't have what you knew in advance they didn't have, is the concepts and ideas to figure out the meaning of that information. And so what concepts or ideas are involved? Another part of reasoning, it's always present, is that in order to figure one thing out, you have to assume that something has already been figured out. You have to take something for granted. Given to prove. There's got to be something that's given something that we, rest ourselves on. We can't build on air. And so our foundations, what we're taking for granted, what we're assuming, we have basically sorted out, are our assumptions. Now, assumptions come in two directions. One, there's the assumptions that the students are likely to make. Two, they're the assumptions that you're making that you may want to check on, and you may want to take that into account in the design of your assignment. Then the next part of reasoning, it's connected with the interpretation but goes beyond it, is if you're going to reason, you're going to come to some conclusions. If you're a good reasoner, you distinguish the evidence from the conclusions. You don't confuse those two. And so the evidence could be the information, the conclusion is the interpretation. That would be one example of the difference between evidence and conclusion. Or it could be reason and the conclusion you've come to on the basis of those reasons, or reasoning. And so you want to be sensitive to that distinction, and it may come up in the way you give the assignment. I would like you to examine the information presented in your textbook on pages so-and-so and come to your own conclusion about such and so. And now let me give you another very essential part of reasoning. And tell us the point of view from which you're coming to that conclusion. Or consider a couple of alternative views in the point of view. Because whenever we reason within a point of view. Okay? Then finally, whenever we reason, our reasoning has implications and consequences. So we start here, reason, come to conclusions. Maybe reason, a little more, come to conclusion. We have to stop somewhere. Wherever we stop, that's not the end. Those conclusions have further implications. So we could reason further and get to those implications, but then those would have other implications. We just have to stop. We stop on. So thinking is never over. Do you see? It never completes itself. It just stops because of time, and we've got as much as we need for our purpose. But it never says, okay, that's it, you got it all. Okay, so wherever you stop, you can ask, what are the implications and consequences? So if you're giving us an idea for how to do things, suppose we put them into action, what are the consequences? Suppose one of the consequences is this: we don't have enough money to do it. You see, if the consequence is you need $50,000 to do this, and we don't have $50,000, then that's not a good idea. Not because ideally it wasn't good, but because it has the consequence that we would need money that we don't have, and so it's a, quote, ideal but not very useful solution in our circumstances, looking at consequences. Or suppose the implication, you come up with a theory of flotation, but it has the following implication, that ice would sink to the bottom if your theory was true. Well, let me remind you of something. Ice does not sink to the bottom. So if your theory has that implication, it isn't that we've been missing ice, there's a problem with your theory. So a theory with false implications is false. So are you looking at the implications of your ideas? So these are the parts of reasoning, and I am not implying that you have the students deal with all of them all the time, because that would be certainly too much. But you should always be aware that at any point in time, they might need to pay attention to that if they were a really good reasoner. So you may want them to use a part of that, some of that, all of that. You may want to call attention to some parts and not others. But you can't do it without calling attention to none of it ever. You've got to call attention to some of it, and you have to know why, roughly why, you're not going to ask this and you are going to ask that. Second part of it is the logic of the content itself. You don't reason about nothing. And the content itself and its logic must be analyzed. So what kind of a question are you asking them? Here's a common mistake: to ask them for a question of opinion, sheer opinion, and then ask for them to justify it. If it's sheer opinion, you can't justify it. So don't ask them for it. It doesn't make any sense. And don't get them arguing about pure taste, because you can't justify pure taste. There is no reason why Jack likes butterscotch pudding better than vanilla, and Jill likes vanilla better than butterscotch. And an assignment that asks students to justify those things is ill-conceived from the word go, because the instructor doesn't understand the logic of the question. And so this has to do with our ability to understand the logic of what we're dealing with. Suppose you're in the history class and you want to give the student an assignment in reasoning. Now here's a point about the logic of history, the logic of the very content of the field. That history is always someone's story about a set of events, the actual events of which are far, far richer than the story that is told, the narrative, and in which 99% of what actually happened is left out, and where the story is told from some point of view for some purpose. Now, the end result of this is that one of the moves you want to make in reading the history book is identifying the point of view of the author, seeing the kinds of questions that are in the foreground for this author in telling this story, and the kinds of questions they're not asking that somebody else might ask, the kinds of information that gets thrown into the background of this book comes out into the foreground of that book. Do you see why this is in the foreground, that's in the background? Do you realize a lot didn't get into this book? So when you understand that logic, you give assignments differently. But if you think, okay, history is a statement of what happened, and you simply list the things that happened, and when you list all the things that happened, that's history, that is incoherent. You don't understand what history is about. That's not history, that's illusion. History involves choices about what to include and what not to include and what to make your fundamental questions. So it's important to understand the logic of what you're teaching, because if you don't get it, students don't have a snowball's chance in hell to get it. You may be leading them down the wrong alley, getting them to misunderstand the logic of the content, turning them forever and ever against it, as many classes do. As Schoenfeld says, what math instruction teaches very well is math hatred. It's extremely successful in achieving that consequent. Of course, that's not the intention, and part of it is the failure on the part of those who are teaching math to understand the logic of math and to understand that it is a mode of reasoning, a mode of figuring things out, and a lack of ability to put questions about this in such a way as to deal with our third factor, which is the logic of the student's reasoning. If to master content you have to reason within the logic of the content using the various parts of reasoning in order to do this, then we have to understand the logic of the student's thinking, because that's what they need to use in order to get into the logic of the content. So, of course, if the content is history, students are living in history every day. They have a history, they think historically, they construct narratives in their mind about the events of their life, they construct narratives that deal with their friends, and it's something they love to do. Everyone loves to do. They talk about themselves and their friends. That's historical thinking. It's usually lousy historical thinking, but it has all the elements present in it. And so we take them to that, we help them to see that, then we bridge that into this. This part represents the hook into this, which is the activity applied to that. And so you need the hook, because without the hook they're not into, they don't get it, it doesn't relate to their thinking, and you have to start their thinking going, because if their thinking doesn't start, it isn't going to go anywhere. There are lots of people who are teaching the class in this way. There is the car, maybe it's a truck, and it's changed to a lot of other cars that do not have their engines on. And the truck takes off, pulling all these cars, and says, see, they're going. Yeah, but their engines aren't turned on. That's okay. We'll get them there. But the drivers are looking out the window and not paying attention to where you're going anyway because they don't have to steer. And so until we get the thinking going, until the engine turns on, nothing else makes sense. So our first task is always, how are we going to hook them? And that means, how are we going to relate to this? The logic of the student's thinking. How are we going to get them to discover a logic they already use that fits into the logic that we want them to learn? So this is the basic theory of the thing. Reasonably complicated, but not overwhelming. And when you think about it, not totally unintuitive either. But the practical challenge, of course, is that depending on the level you teach, you inherit students who haven't done this. And getting into this sort of for the first time, in a way, it's not completely foreign because they're doing it in their life, they're just not doing it in school. They're reasoning about things of significance, they're making assumptions, they're coming to conclusions, and they're even challenging some conclusions and calling for evidence, like, how do you know that? It isn't like they never do that. Or that they never say, that's not the question, this is the question. They do all the things that are involved in reasoning some of the time. But they don't do any of it organized systematically with discipline and skill. Except maybe a little bit in areas of dedicated commitment and where the logic of the subject is so apparent that if you really get involved in it, you can't avoid that logic. For example, basketball. So that if you're interested in basketball, it's very hard not to start to reason about it. And all team players and their coaches do a lot of reasoning about basketball within the logic of basketball, and they usually do some pretty good reasoning there. And by the way, just in passing, in making assignments, think of yourself as the coach of the anthropological reasoning team, or the coach of the historical reasoning team, or the coach of reasoning algebraically. And the students are the players, and make sure they get on the court and start to do some playing. They can't just sit on the sideline and watch you dribbling up and down the court shooting baskets, even if you're good at it. And so you may dribble down the court and take a shot and say, notice I'm squaring myself to the basket and I'm stroking the ball. Now let's all try squaring ourselves to the basket and stroking the ball. And then you get into part of it, but ultimately here reasoning is a performance. And everything, all the performances of the intellectual community involve reasoning. Let's take a performance that doesn't involve reasoning, tying your shoes. Okay? Well, generally the tasks in school are not of the variety of, let's see if we can tie your shoes. Now, that could be a task that requires reasoning for someone. And if it is, then it's a good assignment for them. That is, let's figure out how to tie our shoes. But once you tie your shoes and you learn it, you don't reason about tying your shoes anymore. You just tie away, and get on to other things. So if you take the things that we do now, copying out of the book and bringing it up to the teacher to get stamped didn't take any reasoning. It was something we could do automatically. Making sure that your name is in the right-hand corner of the page and that there's this margin doesn't take any reasoning. And so we want to ask, does this involve reasoning? Does it not involve reasoning? Remember, here's the key point. Reasoning is figuring something out. So, we're going to stop for a couple of minutes, and I want you all to take the cards that you were given. I want you to imagine yourself teaching somewhere in the curriculum, either a course that you have taught, are teaching, or might imagine yourself teaching. It doesn't really matter. Imagine who your students are and imagine where you are in the course. It might be easier if you imagine sort of toward the beginning so that you don't have to explain to us the first 9 weeks of class before you give us the assignment. So a little bit about the size of the class, the level of the class, the students. Give us some cryptic comments there, and then write out the assignment, and then on the back mention things like the hook. I would get them thinking by doing this if it isn't apparent. It may be apparent in the way you frame the assignment, and indicate what is the question at issue. You see, what are they going to be reasoning about? And the question at issue could be, what are the main points in Chapter 1? Unless, of course, the main points in Chapter 1 are summarized at the end of the chapter. That's not reasoning. You see, that's copying out of the book. All right? And then what is, you could indicate one further thing if you get to it, what is going to be the fundamental problem in the reasoning, if there's one, like getting the right information or considering alternative points of view, or so if you see a particular dimension of reasoning that is going to be particularly problematic here, mention it. So something about your students in the class, then we'll have the actual assignment, and then we'll have some points at the back. I'll be collecting those from you in about 10 minutes, and then I'll be commenting on those, and that'll give you some idea of how to take this and make it practical. So let's take about 10 minutes and work on that. And I'll wander around while we're doing this, so if you have particular questions and you want some further advice, perhaps I can help you. And I hope the people who are watching this on video do the same thing. So shut off the video and start writing. Okay, now I have quite a bit of cards here of possible assignments, and as you can see, I'm not going to get through all of them by any means. And remember the purpose here. It's not to say this is a good one, this is a bad one, this is a good one, this is a bad one. It's to illustrate how you as an instructor may be thinking through these, looking for things you want to check on, making sure that the assignment is, number one, plausibly assignment in reasoning, two, one the students can plausibly accomplish, three, with some design that's going to get them involved, and that hopefully will develop their reasoning and the discipline that's involved in reasoning. So here's one. English, secondary school, social issues, The Bean Eaters by Gwendolyn Brooks, I think that is. The hook is social issues as a concern versus art. The purpose, analyze an aspect of the purpose of the poem and its relative merits to increase the reader's ability, make meaning from the text, etc. Method, debate a resolution regarding the poem's message. Resolved, that the message of this poem is more important for its social implication than for its literary quality. Divide class in half. Side A supports the resolution through analysis of subject, language, and tone. Side B negates the resolution through analysis of a subject, language, and tone. Students study poem, record evidence, pool information to build a case. Write and plan brief speeches with assertions, evidence, and conclusion. Students then debate alternative sides with questioning of speakers by opposing sides and reflecting, if possible, opposing views. A student moderator calls on speakers, keeps time, and provides equal opportunity. Student listener observers take note of the major ideas, use of evidence, and give feedback to debates on effectiveness of arguments, can decide which side did a better job and presumably justify their position. Well, this sounds, certainly on the face of it, as a plausible assignment calling for reasoning that students are able to do. What are some of the possible pitfalls of this? One, there's a possible pitfall at the level of the hook. Part of the hook is involved in taking seriously the notion of the literary value of a poem. I think that can be a very difficult thing to get high school students into. Very often, it seems to me, they don't see literary value of itself of any value. And therefore, they might find it difficult to really get into it. However, if you had someone in the class who got into it and they did it in a successful way, then possibly some of the others might be able to get into it. One question I have also is, how are you going to prevent the student evaluators from simply choosing the side that is most effective in manipulating the audience rather than the side that is reasoning well? Because we know in the broader society, the public can't distinguish the two. So why should the students distinguish the two? Why shouldn't they go with the one who amuses them most, who tells the best joke, who comes across with some vitality, and they like them? Well, presumably one possible way is to ask them to justify it with specific categories, and that would be helpful, and I think that is implied here to some extent. So those are just some thoughts about that one. Let me not spend all my time on this one. Let's take another one. Chemistry students, sophomore, junior high school. No, sophomores and juniors in high school. Average or above average students. Periodic table. What do elements in a family of periodic table have in common? How do the trends vary in a family? Hook. Show reactions of different elements with the same substance. Example, air, water, and acid. Well, one of the questions that I wonder about is why they wouldn't just sort of look this up in the book and repeat what the book said. Presumably the book talks about elements in a family in the periodic table and states what they have in common. If the book states what they have in common, why wouldn't they just, look it up in the book or want to look it up in the book or just guess rather than reason? And do they have enough information in what they're given to actually reason their way to that conclusion? Because the characteristics of a family of elements in the periodic table emerged empirically over quite a bit of time. Is this activity in class going to be enough time for them to really reason it through? So those are thoughts that occur to me on that. Now let's look at 12th grade composition literature class at the beginning. Assignment Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Teach students to recognize the positive and negative qualities, exercise their judgment of a book that they find very difficult to read. Hook. Brainstorm the characteristics of great literature as opposed to mediocre. Well, the first thing I wonder about is the hook. Because to brainstorm the characteristics of great literature as opposed to mediocre, do they know any great literature? And therefore, what would their information base be for talking about the characteristics of great literature? It seems to me that's sort of thing that typically is told to them. Great literature has these characteristics. Are they really, and since they haven't read any great literature, most of them, and when they did, they were often bored and didn't like it. So they might say characteristics of great literature: boring, confusing, not very exciting, small print, not very many pictures, or who knows what. At least, I'm not trying to go too far in my caricaturing here, but I see a problem initially there. And I'm wondering if their coming to the characteristics of great literature is more something they've got to develop over the course of the course rather than at the beginning, even in theory. Those are a couple of questions there. Class, student teachers in phase 1 of their student teaching experience. 25 to 30 student teachers who have chosen the Multilingual Multicultural Center, the Teaching of Reading Methods course. Assignment, bring to class color pictures of the students in your student teaching assignment. Purpose, to become aware of who the students are and the points of view they bring to class. Well, I think more would have to be elaborated here for me to dialogue with this, because I'm not sure my first response, bring to class color pictures of the students in your student teaching assignment. I'm not seeing how that, by means of that, you would become aware of who they are. Is it that you get these pictures and then you use the picture and try to deduce from the picture what people who look like this are? I don't know. So I think I'm just not clear enough about that to comment usefully. Course, personal and community health. Topic, behavior change. Level, general education, beginning of the semester. Problem, to change a behavior. Assignment, identify a behavior that is detrimental to your health. Maybe not today, but in 10 to 20 years. 2, keep a journal of the behavior, when it occurs, what you are feeling, etc. 3, set a goal, long range and short range. 4, write a contract to accomplish the short range goal. All right, now notice that a lot of the reasoning that you would do in changing a behavior is provided here. And so you see, in one case, I mean, imagine an assignment that says, develop a program to change your behavior. And analyze what behavior is, what relationship it has to motivation, and how you could design a set of steps whereby if you follow them, you could change the behavior. That would involve them in reasoning about change of behavior in general. This is providing that as a given and then asking them to work within this model. Now, are they going to accept the model because we tell them this is the way you change a behavior? Or are we going to get them to reason through this? Like, is this model going to emerge out of a class discussion in which we say, okay, let's discuss that. What is behavior? How is it motivated? How can we begin to change it, and so forth? Okay, a standing daily assignment, college sophomore literature class. 1, students assigned individual segments, page, stanza, etc., to identify remarkable elements in segment. Why for you are these remarkable? Students know that they have to remark in class. 3, how do you use these elements? How do they help you understand meaning of the text as a whole? Meaning of the text as a whole. 4, this text was apparently valued by the culture that produced it. What do you know about that culture that would help us understand that evaluation? Sometimes, how does your assessment compare to that culture's assessment? Okay, well, these are very ambitious things to be doing, and the immediate question that I would have is the ability of the students to get into this in a reasonable way. Let me look at some of those things. Students assigned individual segments to identify remarkable elements in segment. Why are these remarkable? Now, on one level, what's the difference between remarkable and what is your reaction to it? If the students interpret remarkable as just a reaction, then here's what I would remark. I don't like this one. This one just seems confusing to me. This is a reaction. So presumably the person who's doing this has some discussion of, I don't mean just your reaction, I mean this other thing, and let's try that out, and then you model the behavior of doing what you're talking about here. Then you have them do a little bit of it, then you do it again, and then you have them do it, and you talk, and then they know what you mean by remarkable. So maybe that's what happens here, and then we're ready for this. How do you use these elements? Now, remarkable elements, again, the notion of elements here. What is an element? And how is this introduced? Is it introduced didactically? Like you'll find in a poem 5 elements, or is it worked out inductively? If it's worked out didactically, do they get the logic of it? Or do they just say, okay, for you, there are 5 elements. Got to have 5, or, you know, it's this or that and that and that. So remember, I gave the elements of reasoning, purpose, problem, and so forth. But I never want the students just to take down those 9. They say, okay, there's 9. That's what Professor Paul says. I want them to reason it through. Why is purpose? Why could you not reason without a purpose? Give us an example. Suppose we want to let's look at this. So if there are going to be elements here, and there are elements in literature, And that's basic. I'd want them to really buy into it. I wouldn't want them just to hear, this is Mrs. Jones' 5 elements, or this is Richard Paul's 9 parts of reasoning. And he requires you to go through this, that, and the other. Okay, so some thought about that. Let's see. Try to get a level that we haven't talked about here. 4th grade social studies, how about that? Suburban class, lower middle income, teaching California mission system. I want students to analyze and examine critically the traditional romanticized version presented to them in their current textbook, to rewrite it more accurately. Okay, that's all I have on this. It's a great purpose. Now, how are we going to lead into it? How are we going to get them to understand the logic of it and how they're going to evaluate the text and so forth? So there's quite a bit of work. This is a great purpose. Achieving the purpose involves more reasoning than is here in terms of what the teacher is going to do. 7th grade language arts, character analysis. Who in your life is like so-and-so? Presumably in the story. Which similarities do you recognize? Which similarities do you recognize? List, name, describe these. Which differences do you recognize? List, name, and describe these. Or describe 3. I think it's 3 rather than these. Okay. Noting similarities and differences between characters and persons you know is not very high order reasoning, fairly low order, unless you give them a question at issue. Not just recognize similarities, but give them an issue. Who would you think you could depend upon? Find 2 people who are similar in some way. Now, which of them do you feel you could trust more in a situation that involved self-confidence? And reason, give us your reasoning using characteristics about the one person as you find it in the story and cite the area in the text, versus citing experiences that you've had of the person that you know, or something like that. Something where there's an issue, where they have to get into their experience. But similarities and differences, which is a very popular thing to do, unless it's linked to an issue, can become trivialized. Because there are an infinite number of similarities and differences. And we seek similarities and differences when there's a reason to seek them. And so we need some kind of an issue here, I think, to give this teeth. Trying to get another subject here. Well, let's stop. Okay, so what do we have to do? What do we have to do? How do we devise assignments that students are able to do? Number 1, we have to know the logic of their thinking, know basically the level that they're thinking, and take them up a notch. We certainly can't take them up 5 notches from where they're thinking right off. But we want them to reason, and so we have to hook them. And secondly, we have to think through the content. How does this content work? What is the logic of this content? And we have to get away from content as statement, 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 statement. We have to look at it as a logical system. That's a harder thing to do. What's the purpose of this subject? What sorts of questions are raised by people who study this subject? How do they gather their information? What sort of information do they use? What are some of the key ideas, and what can you do with those ideas that you can't do if you don't have those ideas? So what's the role? Let's take the concept of a market system. Let's take that idea. A market system has 2 features, doesn't it? Market and system. So let's look at systems. What's a system? What's a market? Now, what are some of the issues that are raised in economics? What does this concept have to do with those issues? Could somebody give me a very basic problem in economics? And then let's try to work it through and see if anywhere along the line we need this idea market system. Maybe we'll solve it all. We won't need market system. Maybe we don't need that idea. They say it's important in the textbook. We don't know. We haven't tried it. Don't always believe the textbook. Textbooks can be wrong or something like that. Do you see? So this is the flavor of it. It's a real challenge, but the more you do, the better you get at it. The more you take content and translate it from just sentences into the logic of it, the more you get into students' reasoning, the more you explain and make moves relevant to reasoning. Excellent point, but I'm not sure I see the evidence that supports it. Maybe it's there in your experience. So Judy, could you give us something from your experience that helps us to see why you think that's justified, and you make that move, feel comfortable with it, you're ready to move it. It's this kind of thing. It's a slow process, but a good process, and increasingly you can devise assignments that work better and better. The test is the classroom, and you are the judge. And here is the final question of all questions: does it work? But maybe we should add another question. Is it worth doing? Or maybe even another one. Does it educate? And of course, we know that means, does it develop them as reasoning persons? Thank you very much.